In the sun-scorched expanse of the American frontier, where justice was measured in lead and legends were born in whispers, they said the deadliest gun belonged not to the famous lawmen of dime novels or the notorious outlaws who plagued the territories, but to a ghost, a shadow who moved through frontier towns with calloused hands and steel in his eyes. They called him the Silent Shadow, though few knew his true name, and fewer still lived to speak of his lightning-fast draw. This is the story of Caleb Thorne, whose silent presence brought peace to troubled lands, and whose gun had sent more than 24 men to their graves. Join me today as we delve into the tale of the man they called the Silent Shadow, who proved that the most dangerous predator is often the one that makes no sound at all. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder Creek, Wyoming Territory, 1875. The dust rolled thick and heavy across the prairie, turning the town's weather-beaten boardwalks into islands in a sea of swirling earth. The setting sun painted the clouds blood red, each ray casting long shadows that stretched like grasping fingers across the parched ground. It was on such an evening that Marcus Wade and his band of hired guns first encountered the quiet stranger who would later seal their fates. The Copper Spur Saloon had become the center of Thunder Creek's rapidly expanding cattle empire, though not for its watered-down whiskey or crooked card games. Instead, whispers spread about the mysterious new stablehand whose gentle way with horses had transformed the town's livery into the finest in 3 territories. Some claimed he had a gift for calming even the wildest mustangs, while others swore they'd seen him break horses that had thrown every other wrangler who dared mount them. Caleb Thorne worked in silence, his movements carrying the fluid efficiency of a man who'd learned that words were often unnecessary and sometimes dangerous. The livery's owner, Samuel Harrison, had given him the job with no questions asked, impressed not just by his skill with horses, but by the steady stream of wealthy ranchers who now trusted their prized stallions only to his care. Those who watched him work noticed 3 things: the unusual patience with which he approached each animal, the way his eyes constantly scanned his surroundings as if measuring distances, and the fact that his right hand always stayed free, never far from the one gun belt he wore low on his hip. What none of them knew was that the same hand had won more than 30 gunfights in the hidden corners of the frontier, earning him whispered names like Death's Quiet Man before he vanished from the territory's dueling circles. Now he tended horses instead of graves, though the Colt Peacemaker that had served him so well lay cleaned and loaded in its holster, a constant companion in a land where death could ride in with any dust storm. The weapon's blued steel bore no ornamental engraving, no silver inlay or fancy grips, just honest wear from years of use and the kind of perfect balance that came from a gun becoming one with its owner's hand. Marcus Wade was everything Caleb was not: loud, crude, and proud of his reputation as Thunder Creek's most feared gunman. His father's cattle fortune had brought him influence in the territory's circles, but money couldn't purchase the honor he lacked. He and his band of equally privileged ruffians had made sport of terrorizing the area's merchants and laborers, demanding protection payments with the casual cruelty of men who had never faced true consequences. The first time Wade entered the Copper Spurs stables, Caleb was working with a magnificent black stallion, his hands moving with practiced care as he checked the animal's injured leg. Wade swaggered through the stable, his spurs jingling against the wooden floors, making coarse remarks about the horses, while his companions laughed sycophantically. "Well, well," he drawled, stopping before Caleb's workspace. "What have we here? Another drifter profit from Thunder Creek's opportunities." His shadow fell across the horse like a stain. Caleb continued his work, his movements unhurried. Those who knew him in his previous life would have recognized the dangerous calm in his posture, the same stillness that preceded lightning-fast draws in moonlit dueling grounds. I'm speaking to you, boy. Wade snapped, his hand suddenly resting on his gun belt. It's proper manners to acknowledge your betters. The stable went quiet, the only sound the nervous shuffling of horses sensing the tension in the air. Caleb turned slowly, his dark eyes meeting Wade's with an intensity that made the gunman step back involuntarily. Caleb's hands moved in a series of deliberate gestures, sign language that none of the men understood. The silence that followed seemed to crystallize in the air, delicate and dangerous as frost. Wade's face flushed red, unused to such a direct challenge, especially from a man who wouldn't or couldn't speak. His companions shifted uncomfortably, sensing the change in the atmosphere. Samuel Harrison, watching from the stable's entrance, felt his heart skip a beat. He'd invested too much in his new stable hand to lose him to Wade's notorious temper. "He's mute, Mr. Wade," Harrison explained quickly, stepping forward. "Been that way since he arrived. Best horse handler I've ever seen, though." "Perhaps," Wade said, his voice dropping to a dangerous purr. "You don't understand how things work in Thunder Creek." He leaned closer, his expensive cologne unable to mask the whiskey on his breath. "Every business here pays for protection. Every single one." Caleb's hands never trembled as he returned to tending the stallion's leg, his movements precise and measured. He made another series of signs which Harrison translated with obvious reluctance. "He says he's seen protection in his time. Says true protection comes from honor, not threats." The black stallion, picking up on the tension, stomped nervously. Caleb's hand moved with incredible speed to calm the animal, and something in that fluid motion made Wade's companions take an instinctive step backward. For a moment, the careful facade of the quiet stable hand flickered, and beneath it lurked something that had made hardened gunfighters tremble. Though none of them understood sign language, Caleb's next gestures needed no translation. A simple shrug followed by a dismissive wave of his hand. The message was clear: leave. Wade's hand tightened on his gun belt, his knuckles turning white. Rachel Chen, watching from her father's general store across the street, couldn't suppress a small smile. She had heard rumors about Caleb's peculiar confidence, the way he seemed, unaffected by the threats and schemes that usually plagued newcomers in frontier towns. Some attributed it to naivety, others to foolishness, but there was something in the stable hand's posture that reminded her of her late uncle, a legendary Texas Ranger who died with his boots on and his gun smoking. Wade's gun appeared with sudden violence, not drawn but used as a pointing stick, gesturing at Caleb's chest. "Accidents happen so easily in this territory," he sneered, "especially to those who don't appreciate proper business arrangements." Caleb set his brush down with deliberate care, his movements precise as a surgeon's. He turned to face Wade fully, and something in his gaze made the gunman's companions take another step backward. For a moment, even the horses went still, as if they too sensed the deadly current running beneath the surface of this seemingly simple confrontation. The stranger's hands moved again, and Harrison translated, his voice shaking slightly. "He says he's seen proper business arrangements, Mr. Wade. Says he's seen them conducted with honor in Texas, with dignity in Kansas, and with respect in Colorado." Caleb stood, his slight frame somehow filling the space between them. "What you offer is nothing but common thuggery dressed in expensive leather." Samuel Harrison moved to intervene, but Rachel Chen, who had entered the stable to witness the confrontation, raised a hand to stop him. The young woman had seen enough frontier justice to recognize when deeper currents were moving beneath the surface. There was something about Caleb's stance that spoke of complete confidence, not the false bravado of youth, but the absolute certainty of someone who had measured their opponent and found them wanting. Wade's gang had grown quiet, watching, their leader with nervous anticipation. They'd seen him gun down men for lesser insults, seen businesses burned and lives ruined for the mere suggestion of defiance. But something about this situation felt different. The usual script had gone awry, like actors suddenly discovering they were in a different play entirely. "You have 1 week," Wade snarled, trying to reassert control of the situation. "1 week to reconsider your position. After that—" He let the threat hang in the air, tapping his revolver meaningfully. Caleb's hands moved in a simple gesture, 7 fingers raised, then lowered one by one. 7 days. His eyes never left Wade's, and in their depths lurked something that made even the hardened gunman uncomfortable. Not fear or anger, but the kind of deadly patience that reminded old-timers of a rattlesnake coiled in the sun. Zah! Wade and his men stormed out of the stable, their spurs jingling discordantly against the wooden floors. Rachel Chen finally released the breath she'd been holding. "My friend," she said, approaching Caleb with careful steps, "I do believe you've just made a rather dangerous enemy." Caleb's hands returned to their work, checking the stallion's leg with the same careful precision he'd shown before the interruption. His signs were quick but clear, and Rachel, who had been learning his language over the past months, translated for the others. "Not an enemy, just another man who needs to learn respect." Samuel Harrison began straightening the tools Wade's dramatics had scattered, his hands trembling slightly. "Mr. Thorne, if you wish to leave town, I would understand completely. Wade, he has influence, connections, his father—" Caleb's sharp gesture cut through Harrison's words. He signed slowly, deliberately, and Rachel translated, "His father's money cannot buy him skill, nor can it teach him honor." In the growing twilight, Caleb continued his work, but those watching closely might have noticed how his right hand stayed closer to his gun, how his eyes tracked every shadow that moved across the stable doors. 7 days, his fingers had indicated. 7 days before Thunder Creek discovered why the frontier territories still whispered of a gunman who never spoke, yet whose actions echoed louder than any war cry. Word of the confrontation at the Copper Spur spread through Thunder Creek's dusty streets like wildfire. By nightfall, every saloon and gambling hall buzzed with whispers about the mute stable hand who had dared to defy Marcus Wade. Some praised his courage, others condemned his foolishness, but all waited with bated breath to see how the drama would unfold. At his private suite above the Golden Nugget Saloon, Wade nursed his wounded pride with expensive Kentucky bourbon. His closest companion, James Hawkins, watched with growing concern as his friend's mood darkened with each glass. "Perhaps," Hawkins suggested carefully, polishing his wire-rimmed spectacles, "we should look into this man's background before proceeding further. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story." Wade's laugh held no humor. "A mute stable rat? What's to know?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching it catch the lamplight. Though I must admit, there was something familiar about his bearing, like a card player holding aces and waiting for the right moment to show his hand. In the shadows of the saloon's reading room, an elderly man named William Doc Morrison lowered his newspaper, his interest piqued. He had spent years as a contract surgeon for various railroad companies, patching up the aftermath of countless gun battles. Something about the description of the mute stable hand tugged at old memories, stories whispered around campfires about a gunman who never spoke, who appeared like a spirit of vengeance when justice was needed, then vanished like morning mist. Back at his modest room above the livery stable, Caleb was entertaining an unexpected visitor. Rachel Chen had returned, bringing a small basket of dumplings from her father's kitchen. "You must forgive my intrusion," she said, setting out the meal, "but I felt compelled to warn you. My uncle, before a bullet found him in Dodge City, worked as a deputy marshal. He kept records of every gunfighter worth noting in the territories." She paused, studying Caleb carefully. "Wade's reputation with a gun isn't just talk. 12 men have died trying to prove otherwise. Caleb's smile held secrets older than his years. His hands moved gracefully. The wolf does not fear the serpent merely because it has fangs. Rachel sat down in her teacup with a soft clink. There are rumors, she said carefully, about a series of gunfights in Kansas 3 years ago. A traveling salesman, drunk and cruel, harassing a young Native American family at the railway station. The next morning they found him in the street, alive but humbled, with a single bullet hole through his gun hand. Her eyes met Caleb's. My uncle was there that season. He said the shooter's technique was flawless, yet he moved like a ghost. In the dawn light, Caleb remained motionless, but his right hand moved unconsciously to touch his left shoulder, where beneath his shirt lay a thin scar. A reminder from his earliest days of learning the gun, when speed alone wasn't enough. His hands moved slowly. The past is a different country. I merely tend horses now. Of course, Rachel smiled, rising to leave. At the door she paused. Though I must say the way you handle that colt reminds me of my uncle's stories. He always said the deadliest gunmen were the ones who treated their weapons like old friends. Familiar, respected, but never taken for granted. After Rachel's departure, Caleb moved through the stable's evening routine with practiced efficiency. The town's night watchman, old Pete Wilson, had grown used to the mute stable hand's odd hours, merely nodding as Caleb checked each stall, each lock, with the kind of attention that spoke of a man who understood that details could mean the difference between life and death. In the growing darkness, Caleb's hands moved with purpose, but tonight he wasn't just tending horses. His fingers traced the worn grip of his peacemaker, checking the action with the same careful precision he showed his. Four-legged charges. The weapon was like him, unadorned, utilitarian, with a history written in wear patterns and subtle marks that told stories to those who knew how to read them. The gun's previous owner had been a lawman in Texas, one of the few people who knew Caleb's full story. Before consumption took him, Marshal Daniel Hayes had passed the weapon to Caleb with words that still echoed in his memory. A gun's just a tool, son. It's the man behind it that decides if it serves justice or tyranny. 6 days remained until Wade's deadline, and already the pieces were moving on a board far larger than the arrogant gunman could imagine. In his silent years on the frontier, Caleb had learned more than just gunfighting. He had learned patience, strategy, and the art of letting an opponent's arrogance become their downfall. The following morning brought an unexpected development to Thunder Creek. A stage arrived from Cheyenne, carrying among its passengers an elderly gentleman who moved with the measured grace of someone used to dangerous situations. Judge William Hawthorne's silver hair and Eastern clothes marked him as out of place in the rough frontier town, but his eyes held the sharp awareness of a man who had seen his share of frontier justice. He paused at the livery stable's entrance, watching Caleb work with quiet intensity. After several minutes of observation, he spoke in a voice weathered by years of trail dust. The way you're favoring that right hand. Santa Fe, wasn't it? The summer of '72. Caleb's movements stilled, but he didn't turn around. His hands remained steady as he continued brushing the horse, but his shoulders tensed slightly, a tell that only someone looking for it would notice. I was circuit judge in New Mexico that season, Hawthorne continued, stepping into the stable's shadowed interior. 3 of the territory's most notorious gunmen were found face down in the dust outside the Silver Dollar. Not dead, that was what caught my attention. Each one shot through the right hand with surgical precision, clean through the tendons that make a trigger finger work. He moved closer, lowering his voice. They refused to name their attacker, but one of them, delirious with pain, kept muttering about a man who moved without sound, who answered their challenges with nothing but cold steel and colder eyes. Meanwhile, across town, Marcus Wade was conducting his own investigations. His inquiries had led him to the telegraph office, where an operator named Jenkins claimed to have information about mysterious messages concerning a silent gunman. The ghost of the territories, some called him. "Never leaves 'em dead," Jenkins whispered, glancing nervously over his shoulder. "That's what makes him different. Every famous gun in the West, they've got notches on their belts, but this one, he leaves 'em alive. Crippled sometimes, but alive, always with a mark that ensures they'll never draw against another soul." Wade scoffed, but his hand tightened around his gun belt. "Fairy stories to frighten children. I'm asking about Caleb Thorne." Jenkins's smile held no humor. "Mr. Wade, you don't understand. The stories say he never speaks, this ghost gunman. Instead, he lets his gun do his talking, and its message is always the same. Justice may be silent, but it always finds its mark." Back at the stable, Judge Hawthorne had moved closer to Caleb's workspace. "There are those who would pay handsomely to know what really happened in Santa Fe," he mentioned casually. "Those men were feared across 3 territories. Their kind doesn't just lay down their guns without a fight." Caleb finally turned to face him, his dark eyes holding shadows deeper than the stable's corners. His hands moved in deliberate gestures that the judge, surprisingly, seemed to understand. "And what of the family they threatened?" Hawthorne translated. "Did those who seek answers care about the widow and children who would have died if not for intervention?" The judge had the grace to look away first. "You've built quite a life here," he observed, changing tactics. "It would be a shame if the past were to resurface." "The past never truly left," Caleb's hands replied. "It simply waited, like a bullet in the chamber, for the moment when justice demanded its release." As Hawthorne left the stable, he passed Rachel Chen carrying a basket of fresh bread. The young woman had spent her morning fielding increasingly aggressive inquiries about the mute stable hand. Someone was asking questions in the town's darker corners, offering money for information about Caleb's movements and habits. Thunder Creek itself seemed to hold its breath as the countdown continued. 5 days remained until Wade's deadline, but as the pieces moved on this elaborate board, it became increasingly unclear who was truly the hunter and who was the prey. Every gesture Caleb made, every silent interaction seemed weighted with hidden meaning, like a complex dance where only some of the participants knew the true steps. In his room that evening, Caleb sat at a small table, his movements precise as he cleaned his peacemaker. The routine was more than just maintenance. It was meditation, a way of centering himself before whatever storm was brewing. Each piece of the gun held memories. The barrel, worn smooth from thousands of draws. The cylinder, each chamber telling its own story of justice served. The hammer, its surface bearing the subtle marks of countless silent conversations. A knock at his door revealed Samuel Harrison, the livery owner's face lined with concern. "Riders came in from Laramie," he said without preamble. "They say Marcus Wade's sent for help. 3 gunmen, professionals, one of them—" He swallowed hard. "One of them is Jake the Snake Morrison." Caleb's hands moved in question, and Harrison nodded. "Yes, the same Morrison who killed those homesteaders up in Montana. They say he's never lost a gunfight, and he—" Harrison's voice dropped to a whisper. "He specializes in handling problems for wealthy ranchers." If Harrison expected fear or concern from his stable hand, he was disappointed. Caleb's hands moved with their usual calm precision. "Every snake, no matter how deadly, can be handled if you know where to grab it." The evening brought another visitor. Doc Morrison, still sharp despite his years of patching up the aftermath of frontier justice. He found Caleb in the stable's small office, apparently writing in a leather-bound journal. "Interesting thing about silence," the old doctor mused, settling his weathered frame into a chair. "In my experience, those who don't speak with their voices often have the most to say." He watched as Caleb's hands stilled over the journal. I was in Dodge City 5 years back, saw something peculiar. A gunman who'd built quite a reputation, cruel sort who liked to hurt people who couldn't fight back. Someone called him out one morning just as the sun was rising. Strangest gunfight I ever saw. Over in less than a heartbeat, and the notorious gunman found himself with a shattered gun hand and a lesson in humility. Caleb's hands moved, and Morrison smiled. Yes, I learned to read signs during the war. Had a whole company of Apache scouts who taught me. They also taught me something else, that sometimes the most dangerous predator is the one that warns without sound. Word of Wade's hired guns spread through Thunder Creek like a prairie fire. Jake Morrison's reputation alone was enough to make. Most men consider leaving town, but it was his companions who truly worried those who knew frontier history. The Reeves brothers, twins who had carved a bloody path across Colorado, were said to be able to read each other's thoughts in a gunfight, moving like mirror images of death. In the saloon, Wade held court, his confidence restored by the knowledge that 3 of the deadliest guns in the territory were riding to his aid. By week's end, he boasted, Thunder Creek will remember what happens to those who defy the natural order of things. But in a quiet corner, Judge Hawthorne sat with Rachel Chen, sharing stories that painted a very different picture of natural order. Your uncle, he said softly, would have understood what's really happening here. He knew that true justice doesn't always wear a badge or speak with a loud voice. Sometimes it moves silent as a shadow, patient as the moon's passage across the sky. Rachel's eyes widened as understanding dawned. The stories, she whispered, all those tales of the silent gunman who appears when justice is needed most. They're not just stories, are they? The judge's smile held secrets. In my experience, Miss Chen, the most important stories are the ones that hide their truth in plain sight, like a gun under a peaceful man's coat. As night fell over Thunder Creek, Caleb stood at his window watching the stars emerge. His journal lay open on the table, its pages filled not with words but with precise drawings, diagrams of the town's streets and alleys, notes on distances and angles, the kind of details that only a man intimately familiar with the geometry of gunfights would consider important. 4 days remained until Wade's deadline, but in the quiet darkness of his room, Caleb's hands moved in a simple gesture, a prayer perhaps, or a promise. In the stable below, the horses shifted restlessly, as if they too sensed that Thunder Creek was balanced on the edge of a reckoning that would reveal just how loud silence could become when backed by steel and unwavering purpose. Late that night, Rachel returned to her father's store, her mind churning with the day's revelations. Through the store's back window, she could see light still burning in Caleb's room above the stable. His shadow moved across the lamplight, and she found herself remembering more of her uncle's stories, tales of a peculiar kind of frontier justice that moved like mist through the territories. There are some men, her uncle had once told her, who carry their demons so quietly that you'd never know they were there, but push them too far, back them into a corner where innocent lives are at stake, and those demons emerge wearing 6-shooters and dispensing the kind of justice that leaves men breathing but broken. In the telegraph office, Jenkins was finishing his late shift when an urgent message came through from Laramie. His hands trembled as he decoded the text, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool night air. The message was brief but chilling. Morrison party departed at noon stop. Incident Sweetwater Station stop. 3 men challenged Morrison stop. All 3 disabled stops. No fatalities stop. Morrison quotes, just warming up, stop. The news would reach Wade by morning, adding to his growing confidence, but there was a detail Jenkins kept to himself, a second message that had arrived just minutes later from an unknown sender. Tell the silent one, old debts remember their debtors. At the Golden Nugget, Wade had gathered his closest supporters, planning his strategy for the coming confrontation. Morrison's reputation alone should be enough. he boasted, pouring another round of bourbon. But with the Reeves twins backing, his play, that mute fool won't even have time to draw. James Hawkins, however, noticed something his friend had missed. "The stable," he said quietly. "Have you seen how he's been rearranging things? Moving hay bales, shifting water troughs, adjusting the positions of the hitching posts." "What of it?" Wade demanded. "My father fought in the war," Hawkins explained, cleaning his spectacles nervously. "Said the most dangerous sharpshooters weren't the ones who made the fanciest shots. They were the ones who spent days preparing. Their ground, turning every piece of cover, every shadow, every angle to their advantage." Judge Hawthorne, overhearing this conversation from his corner table, smiled into his whiskey. He was remembering another time, another place, a courthouse in Santa Fe where 3 notorious gunmen had tried to free their compatriot from justice. The breakout attempt had ended before it truly began, each would-be rescuer found with precisely placed wounds that ended their gunfighting days forever. No one had seen the shooter, but in the aftermath, witnesses spoke of shadows that moved against the wind and the whisper of well-oiled steel. In his room, Caleb continued his preparations. His journal now contained not just diagrams of Thunder Creek's layout, but detailed observations about Wade's men, their habits, their tendencies, the tells that revealed when they were about to draw. A good gunman, his mentor had taught him, wins with his mind before his hand ever touches steel. Another page held sketches of Morrison and the Reeves twins, drawn from descriptions and reputation. Jake Morrison, they said, liked to toy with his opponents, wearing them down psychologically before the actual fight. The twins were different, cold, methodical, moving in perfect synchronization like deadly mirror images. But Caleb had faced their kind before. His hands moved in the lamplight, practicing the same fluid gestures he'd used countless times. Each motion was a word in a language of violence and justice, a dialect few lived to fully understand. Tomorrow would bring Morrison and his companions, but tonight was for preparation, for the quiet work that transformed a simple stable into a killing ground where silence would become thunder. Dawn broke over Thunder Creek with the color of old. Brass, painting the town's weather-beaten buildings in shades of tarnished gold. The morning stage brought more than just mail and passengers. It carried whispers of what had happened at Sweetwater Station, tales that made even hardened frontiersmen check their gun belts and speak in hushed tones. Jake Morrison and the Reeves. Twins had made an example of 3 cocky young gunmen who'd thought to make their reputation by challenging the infamous killer. Witnesses described the encounter in terrified whispers, how Morrison had smiled throughout the entire confrontation, how the twins had moved like prairie wolves circling wounded prey, how the whole thing had ended in less time than it took to draw a deep breath. "Didn't even kill him," the stage driver reported to his rapt audience outside the Copper Spur. "Just broke him. Like a man might break a wild horse, except there ain't no coming back from the kind of break-in they did." In his stable, Caleb continued his morning routine with methodical precision, but those who knew where to look might have noticed subtle changes. The water trough had been shifted slightly, creating a clear line of fire to the street. New hay bales had been stacked with careful casualness, providing cover while appearing entirely innocent. Even the hitching posts seemed somehow different, spaced in a way that would force approaching riders to move exactly where Caleb wanted them. Rachel Chen arrived with her usual morning delivery of fresh bread, but today she carried something else, a worn leather pouch that had belonged to her uncle. "Found this in his effects," she said quietly, placing it on Caleb's workbench. "Thought you might find it interesting." Inside the pouch was a collection of newspaper clippings, yellowed with age but carefully preserved. Each one told a similar story. Mysterious gunfights where notorious killers had been defeated by an unknown opponent, left alive but unable to ever draw a gun again. The dates and locations formed a pattern, a trail leading across the territories. like a ghost's footprints. Caleb's hands moved in thanks, but Rachel wasn't finished. "There's something else," she said, pulling out a faded photograph. "This was taken in Dodge City 3 years ago. Look in the background, behind the crowd." The photograph showed the aftermath of a famous gunfight, but in the shadows of a distant doorway, barely visible, stood a figure whose stance was hauntingly familiar. Though the face was unclear, the way the man held himself, the particular angle of his gun belt, it could have been Caleb's twin. "My uncle," Rachel continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper, "he had a theory about why some of the most dangerous men in the territories never spoke. He said sometimes a man sees so much, learns so much about justice and its lack, that words become inadequate. Sometimes silence is the only response to a world that won't listen to reason." Before Caleb could respond, the town's warning bell began to toll. 3 riders had been spotted approaching from the east, their figures black against the rising sun. Judge Hawthorne, watching from his hotel window, noted how they rode. Morrison in the lead, straight-backed and confident, the Reeves twins flanking him like dark angels of death. "Showtime," Wade crowed from his vantage point at the Golden Nuggets balcony, but James Hawkins, ever observant, noticed something his friend had missed. The street was emptying, yes, but not in panic. People were moving with purpose, taking positions that seemed almost choreographed. The elderly Chinese laundryman, usually so stooped and humble, now stood straight-backed in his doorway, something long and wrapped in canvas propped beside him. The Mexican farrier, who everyone dismissed as simple muscle, had positioned himself on the blacksmith's roof, a rifle-shaped bundle near his hand. Even Sarah, the young girl who swept the boarding house steps, seemed to be following some unspoken script as she gathered her broom and moved to a very specific spot in a nearby alley. Morrison swung down from his saddle with fluid grace, his spurs chiming softly against the packed earth. "Interesting," he mused, studying the stable's entrance. "Very interesting indeed." "What is?" Wade demanded, but Morrison ignored him, his attention fixed on subtle details that most would miss. "You see it too, don't you, boys?" he asked the twins, who nodded in perfect unison. "How does the water trough create a natural barrier? How would those hay bales provide perfect cover for someone who knew exactly where they'd be? How does every approach to that stable force us to expose ourselves?" Wade's face darkened with anger and confusion. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying," Morrison replied, his gentle voice taking on an edge, "that your mute stable hand isn't just some drifter who needs to learn his place. This," he gestured at the carefully arranged scene before them, "this is the work of someone who knows exactly what he's doing, someone who's turned this whole street into a killing ground." In the stable, Caleb continued his work, but his movements had taken on a different quality, the same fluid efficiency, but now with an underlying tension like a coiled spring. His hands moved occasionally in what looked like random gestures, but Judge Hawthorne, watching from his window, recognized them as signals to unseen allies. Rachel Chen had positioned herself in her father's store, a Winchester rifle hidden beneath the counter. She remembered her uncle's words. "In a real gunfight, half the battle is fought before the first shot. It's about position, about preparation, about knowing exactly where every friend and foe will be when the thunder rolls." Morrison took a few steps into the street, his black-gloved hands nowhere near his guns. "You've got it wrong, Wade," he said, loud enough to carry. "The question isn't whether your stable hand will learn his place. The question is whether you've just dragged us all into someone else's carefully planned endgame." The Reeves twins exchanged glances, their usual confidence showing the first hints of uncertainty. They had survived this long by reading situations, by sensing traps before they could spring. And everything about this situation felt like a trap, one that had been laid with the patience of a spider and the precision of a surgeon. Wade's face contorted with rage. You're paid to handle problems, not philosophize. Morrison's laugh was soft and deadly as a rattler's warning. Oh, but that's exactly what I'm doing. You see, I've heard stories. Stories about a man who never speaks, who appears in troubled towns and dispenses a very particular kind of justice. They say he never kills, just leaves his opponents with very specific injuries, the kind that ensure they'll never harm another soul. In the stable, Caleb's hands had stilled on the horse he was grooming. His head was slightly cocked, listening to Morrison's words carrying clearly in the morning air. They call him different names in different places, Morrison continued. The silent judge, the ghost hand, the mute angel of justice. But all the stories share one detail. He's always exactly where he needs to be, exactly when he needs to be. There with everything arranged just so. He gestured at the street around them. Kind of like this. Wade's face had turned an ugly shade of purple. Are you saying you're afraid of some mute, stable hand? Afraid? Morrison's smile was terrible in its gentleness. No, I'm intrigued. You see, 2 years ago in Kansas, I witnessed his handiwork. 3 of the meanest guns in the territory, each one shot through the hand in exactly the same place, with exactly the same precision. The kind of shooting that isn't just skill, it's art. The Reeves twins had begun to move, trying to find positions that wouldn't leave them exposed. But everywhere they looked, they found angles covered, approaches blocked, potential cover already occupied by seemingly innocent townspeople who might not be so innocent after all. So, here's what I think, Morrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the suddenly very attentive street. I think you've done something very foolish, Mr. Wade. I think you've mistaken silence for weakness, patience for fear, and preparation for coincidence. And I think you've hired us to walk into a trap that's been days, maybe weeks in the making. Doc Morrison, watching from his surgery window, felt an old familiar tension in the air. The same feeling he'd known before great battles, when the first shots were yet to be fired, but the killing ground was already chosen. He noticed how Caleb had positioned himself perfectly in relation to every possible angle of attack, how his seemingly casual stance left his gun hand free and ready. More than that, Jake Morrison continued, his musical voice taking on a note of professional admiration, I think I know exactly who your stable hand is. There's only one man in all the territories who works like this, who turns an entire town into a weapon without a single soul realizing it until it's too late. Wade spat into the dust. You talk too much, Morrison. Either do what I'm paying you for, or what? Morrison's gentle voice cut through Wade's bluster like a razor. You'll find someone else? Someone who doesn't recognize the signature of the man who single-handedly disarmed the Sutton gang in Colorado, who doesn't know the stories of the silent avenger who took down the Wilson brothers in Nebraska. In the stable doorway, Caleb's hands moved in a simple gesture. To most, it would have looked like nothing, a working man stretching tired muscles. But Judge Hawthorne saw the truth of it, a signal, a message to those who knew how to read such things. Get ready. Thunder Creek held its breath, waiting for the storm to break. In that moment of tension, time seemed to stretch like molasses, each second pregnant with possibility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the street, shadows that seemed to point like accusing fingers at the men who had come looking for easy violence and found instead a carefully laid trap. Last chance, Wade, Morrison said softly. Walk away. Leave the stable hand be. Find easier prey. But Wade, his face purple with rage and wounded pride, had passed the point of reason. Shoot him, he screamed. Shoot them all. The words had barely left his mouth when several things happened at once. The twins moved with their famous coordination, splitting apart to seek better positions. Morrison's hand dropped to his gun with practiced grace. And in the stable doorway, Caleb shifted his weight ever so slightly, a movement so subtle it would have been missed by anyone not trained to watch for such things. Rachel's hands tightened. On the Winchester beneath the counter, Judge Hawthorne straightened in his chair, his weathered hand resting near an old cavalry pistol. Throughout Thunder Creek, seemingly innocent townspeople made their own subtle preparations, each one a piece in Caleb's carefully arranged chess game. "Hold!" Morrison called, his gentle voice cutting through the tension like a knife. The twins froze, their instincts for survival overriding Wade's commands. "You feel it too, don't you, boys? The wrongness of it all?" The identical gunmen nodded, their cold eyes scanning the street with new understanding. Where before they had seen only random townspeople and ordinary objects, now they recognized the careful positioning of it all. How every innocent-looking obstacle could become cover. How every townsperson stood exactly where they needed to be to control the street's killing zones. 3 years ago, Morrison continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of a man telling a story around a campfire. "I heard a gunfight in New Mexico. A gang of raiders had taken over a small town, thinking they could terrorize the locals into submission. They found themselves facing a single man, a mute drifter who'd been working as a stable hand." Wade's hand twitched toward his gun, but Morrison's next words froze him in place. Not one of those raiders died that day, but every single one of them left that town with their gun hands ruined, each wound placed with surgical precision. The interesting part? Witnesses said the whole thing was over in less than a minute, and the mute man never seemed to move from the stable doorway where he'd been standing. In the growing tension, Doc Morrison remembered something from his army days. How the best ambush positions were the ones that looked completely natural until the trap was sprung. Looking around Thunder Creek now, he saw the same principles at work. Every water trough, every hitching post, every stack of supplies had been positioned to create overlapping fields of fire while appearing entirely innocent. The locals called him the Ghost, Morrison went on, his voice almost dreamy, said he had a way of appearing in troubled towns, setting things right, then vanishing like morning mist. Never spoke a word, never killed a soul, but left his mark in a way that couldn't be ignored. Caleb remained motionless in the stable doorway, but his presence seemed to grow larger, filling the space with unspoken tension. His hands, resting loosely at his sides, carried the same casual readiness that had made him legendary in circles where such things were discussed in whispers. "You want to know the really interesting part?" Morrison's gentle voice took on an edge of professional admiration. Every time, the setup was the same. The whole town turned into a trap, with everyday folk positioned just so, and the troublemakers never realizing until it was too late that they were standing exactly where he wanted them. The Reeves twins exchanged another glance, their identical faces showing the first real traces of concern anyone had ever seen on them. They had built their reputation on being able to control any situation through perfect coordination. But now they found themselves in a scenario where every possible move seemed to play into someone else's plan. Wade, however, remained oblivious to the deeper currents moving beneath the surface. "Enough ghost stories," he snarled. "I didn't hire you three to swap tales like old women at a quilting bee. Either you deal with this problem or what?" Morrison interrupted, his soft voice somehow more threatening than any shout. "You'll find someone else? Someone who doesn't recognize the work of the man who single-handedly disarmed every member of the Carter gang without taking a single step? Who hasn't heard the whispers about a mute gunman who appears like judgment itself? When justice is needed, the morning sun had climbed higher, shortening the shadows but intensifying the heat that seemed to shimmer in waves off the packed earth of Thunder Creek's main street. Every window, every doorway, every alley mouth seemed to hold watching eyes. Though few people were visible, The town itself had become a character in this unfolding drama, its very architecture now part of an elaborate trap years in the making. "Last chance," Morrison said, his voice carrying clearly in the tense silence. "Walk away, Wade. Find easier prey, because I'm starting to think we're not the hunters here at all." In the general store, Rachel's finger curled around the Winchesters. Trigger, remembering her uncle's lessons about patience and timing. Judge Hawthorne's hand stayed near his cavalry pistol, his eyes tracking the subtle shifts in position as everyone on the street tried to find their place in this deadly dance. Wade's answer came in the form of a wild shot fired at the stable doorway, the bullet kicking up splinters from the wooden frame. The sound echoed off Thunder Creek's buildings like the first thunderclap of an approaching storm, and in its wake, the carefully arranged pieces of Caleb's trap began to move. The moment Wade's bullet struck the stable doorframe, Thunder Creek exploded into carefully orchestrated chaos. The Reeves twins moved like mirror images, diving for cover that suddenly seemed inadequate. Morrison dropped and rolled with fluid grace, his gun appearing in his hand as if by magic. But Caleb hadn't moved at all. He stood in exactly the same position, as if the bullet hadn't passed within inches of his head. Only his eyes had changed, taking on the flat, deadly focus that old-timers claimed could freeze a rattlesnake in mid-strike. "Oh, hold your fire, you fool!" Morrison's musical voice carried an edge of real anger now. "Can't you see he's—" But Wade, caught in the grip of wounded pride and blind rage, fired again and again. Each shot kicked up splinters around the stable doorway, but Caleb remained unmoved, like a statue carved from the very wood he stood before. Then his hands began to move. To most observers, the gestures might have appeared random, perhaps the nervous fidgeting of a man under fire. But Judge Hawthorne, watching intently from his window, recognized them for what they were, a complex language of signals, each motion precise and purposeful. All across Thunder Creek, seemingly ordinary citizens responded. The Chinese laundryman's bundle came unwrapped, revealing a carefully maintained Spencer carbine. The Mexican farrier on the blacksmith's roof shifted position, a Sharp's rifle glinting in the morning sun. Even young Sarah, the boarding house sweeper, produced a derringer from her apron pocket with practiced ease. "Sweet Jesus," one of the Reeves twins breathed, the first words anyone had ever heard him speak. "The whole damn town is his weapon," Morrison finished, a note of professional admiration in his gentle voice. "Has been from the moment he arrived. Every person, every position, every angle, all part of his plan." Wade, finally sensing the trap he'd walked into, turned his gun toward Morrison. "I'm paying you to—" The rest of his words were lost in the sharp crack of a rifle shot. The gun flew from Wade's hand, accompanied by a spray of blood from his knuckles. He howled in pain and outrage, but the sound was cut short by the realization that the shot had come from behind him, from the direction of the Golden Nugget's balcony. James Hawkins stood there, rifle still smoking, his wire-rimmed spectacles glinting in the morning sun. "I tried to warn you, Marcus," he called down. "Tried to make you see what was really happening here. Some of us have known for weeks who our quiet stable hand really was. The Reeves twins, reading the shifting tide with the instinct that had kept them alive through countless gunfights, began to edge away from their positions. But everywhere they turned, they found their movements anticipated, covered by townspeople who suddenly looked far more dangerous than their everyday appearances suggested. Morrison alone seemed untroubled by this turn of events. If anything, his gentle smile had grown wider. "You know what fascinates me most?" he mused, his gun held loosely but ready. "Not the trap itself, though it's beautifully laid, I must admit. No, what fascinates me is the patience, the willingness to spend weeks, maybe months, setting everything in place, turning an entire town into a weapon, piece by piece, person by person." In the stable doorway, Caleb's hands moved again. This time, Rachel Chen translated from her position in the store. He says there's still time to walk away. No one needs to be hurt today. Wade, clutching his bleeding hand, snarled defiance. Do you think this changes anything? My father owns half this territory. One telegram and what? Judge Hawthorne's voice cut through the morning air as he emerged from his hotel. More men will come to be met by more townsfolk who've learned to stand against tyranny. How many hired guns can you afford to lose, Mr. Wade? The judge's words carried weight, but it was the paper he held that caught Wade's attention. A telegram from the territorial governor himself. You see, Hawthorne continued, some of us have been gathering evidence, banking records, witness statements, documentation of your family's more creative business practices, all waiting to be released unless certain changes are made in how the Wade empire conducts itself. Morrison's musical laugh carried across the tense street. Oh, this is even better than I'd heard. Not just a trap for today, but a complete dismantling of a corrupt system. Tell me, he addressed Caleb directly, how long have you been planning this? How many towns like Thunder Creek have you transformed from victims into vectors of justice? Caleb's only response was to shift his weight slightly, his right hand still nowhere near his gun, but somehow more threatening for that very reason. Those who knew what to look for could read volumes in that simple movement, the perfect balance, the contained energy, the absolute certainty of someone who had choreographed every moment of this confrontation long before it began. The Reeves twins had reached their own decision. With the synchronized movement that had made them famous, they slowly unbuckled their gun belts and let them fall to the dust. Smart boys, Morrison commented, his gentle voice carrying clear approval. They don't teach that kind of wisdom in most gunfighting circles, knowing when you're outmaneuvered, outplanned, and completely out of options. Wade stared at his hired guns in disbelief. Cowards, all of you! His words cut off as Caleb finally moved. The motion was so smooth, so perfectly executed, that many observers would later swear they hadn't seen him draw at all. One moment, his hand was empty. The next, his peacemaker seemed to materialize, already aimed with deadly precision. But Wade never saw the gun. His attention was captured entirely by Caleb's eyes that held not anger or hatred, but something far more terrifying, absolute certainty. In them, Wade saw the truth that Morrison had been trying to tell him, that he hadn't hired guns to deal with a troublesome, stable hand. He had unknowingly challenged a force of nature, a living embodiment of frontier justice who had spent weeks preparing for this very moment. Remarkable, Morrison breathed, studying the tableau before him. With a professional's eye, the gun's not even the real weapon, is it? This whole town, every person, every position, it's all one giant trap, and we walked right into it exactly as you planned. Rachel Chen, watching from her position in the store, remembered her uncle's words about true gunfighters, how the best ones won their battles long before the first shot was fired, through preparation, position, and the ability to read both people and situations with perfect clarity. In the growing heat of the morning, Thunder Creek held its breath. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence and peace hanging in perfect equilibrium. Every person on the street knew their role in what might come next, roles that had been carefully assigned and rehearsed through weeks of subtle preparation. Yet it was Wade himself who finally broke the tension, though not in any way anyone expected. Looking into Caleb's unwavering eyes, something seemed to crack inside him. The arrogance, the blind rage, the certainty of his own power, all of it fell away, leaving behind something smaller and more human. "Who?" he whispered, his voice trembling. "Who are you, really?" Caleb's free hand moved in a series of graceful gestures. Judge Hawthorne, still holding the damning telegram, translated, He says he's what you and your kind created. Justice that learned to move in silence, mercy that learned to speak through steel. The consequence of thinking that money and power put you above the law. Morrison's gentle laugh carried a note of genuine delight. Oh, that's perfect. Absolutely. Perfect. You know, I came here today expecting to add to my reputation. Instead, I find myself in the middle of a legend in the making. The silent avenger who turns entire towns into weapons of justice. The Reeves twins had begun to back away, their matching faces showing something rarely seen, respect tinged with fear. They'd built their reputation on being able to read situations, to anticipate their opponent's moves. But this was like trying to outmaneuver a flash flood or predict where lightning would strike. You know what this reminds me of? Morrison continued, his musical voice carrying across the tense street. A tale I heard down in Mexico about a village that had been terrorized by bandits. Story goes, a stranger rode in one day, never spoke. A word, just started working as a stable hand. Week by week, month by month, things in that village started to change. People standing straighter, learning new skills, finding their courage. Wade's face had gone pale, the blood from his injured hand staining the dust at his feet. This is impossible. You're just one man. That's where you're wrong, Judge Hawthorne interjected. Look around you, Mr. Wade. Really look. Every person you see has been touched by his example, taught by his patience, and shown that there's a different way to face tyranny. And it was true. Looking around Thunder Creek now, Wade could see how everything had changed during the week since Caleb's arrival. The Chinese laundryman no longer stooped or shuffled. He stood straight, his rifle held with the confidence of long practice. The Mexican farrier's position on the roof showed evidence of careful training in choosing firing positions. Even Sarah, the young girl with the derringer, held her weapon with the steady hands of someone who had been carefully taught. Caleb's hands moved again, and this time it was Rachel who translated. He says every town has its own strength, its own justice. Sometimes it just needs someone to show them how to find it. Morrison nodded appreciatively. I heard what happened to the Sutton gang last year. Everyone wondered how one man could have possibly disarmed 8 hardened killers. But it wasn't. One man, was it? It was an entire town prepared and positioned just like this one. The morning sun had climbed higher, its heat beginning to shimmer off the packed earth of Thunder Creek's main street. In that heat-hazed silence, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew everyone's attention. A rider was coming in fast from the direction of the telegraph office. Message for Mr. Wade, the rider called, waving a yellow paper. From your father! Wade's face lit up with desperate hope. Read it, he commanded. The rider's voice carried, clearly, son, stop. Judge Hawthorne's evidence received a stop. Family banking records exposed, stop. Stand down immediately and stop. No more violence, stop. The paper fell from Wade's trembling fingers. All his life, he'd relied on his family's money and influence to back his play. Now, faced with the reality that even that support had been methodically stripped away, he seemed to physically shrink. Caleb's gun hadn't wavered, but something in his stance shifted subtly. Those who knew how to read such things, Morrison, the Reeves twins, Judge Hawthorne, recognized the change. The trap was complete, the lesson delivered, and now came the moment of choice. His free hand moved in another series of gestures. This time it was the doctor who translated. He says every man has 2 paths before him. One leads to more violence, more pain, more reasons for good people to learn the ways of the gun. The other, Wade looked up, meeting Caleb's steady gaze. The other, Morrison's gentle voice provided the answer. The other path is the harder one, Mr. Wade. It's the path of change, of making amends, of turning power into protection instead of tyranny. I've seen men take both paths in my time. The smart ones, the ones who live to see old age, they usually choose the second. In the stable doorway, Caleb finally lowered his peacemaker. The movement was as smooth and purposeful as its drawing had been, an eloquent statement in itself. His hands moved again, and Rachel translated one final message. "The choice is yours, but choose wisely, because while I may leave Thunder Creek someday, what I've built here will remain. This town will never be defenseless again." Judge Hawthorne stepped forward, the telegram from the territorial governor still in his hand. "Your father has already chosen his path, Mr. Wade. He agreed to a full audit of his business practices, fair wages for his workers, and a complete restructuring of how the Wade Empire operates in this territory. The only question now is, will you be part of that change, or will you stand against it?" The silence that followed seemed to contain all the tension of the past weeks, all the careful preparation and patient teaching that had transformed Thunder Creek from just another frontier town into something else entirely. A symbol of what could happen when good people learned to stand together against tyranny. Wade looked around one final time, seeing his situation with new clarity. Every window, every doorway, every position of apparent advantage had been carefully prepared to neutralize him and his hired guns. More than that, every person he'd dismissed as weak or unimportant had been transformed into a defender of their town. The trap hadn't just been physical, it had been psychological, social, complete, in every detail. His shoulders slumped in defeat, but strangely, there was something almost like relief in his voice when he finally spoke. "I choose the second path. God help me. I choose to change." Morrison holstered his gun with elegant precision, his gentle smile never wavering. "Now that," he said softly, "is the kind of wisdom that lets a man grow old in the territories." He turned to address Caleb directly. "I don't suppose you're looking for partners in this enterprise of yours? The idea of teaching towns to protect themselves, that's quite appealing to a man who's seen too many good people fall to bad men's ambitions." Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel translated, "He says justice isn't a business venture. It's a calling that each must find in their own way." The Reeves twins exchanged one of their identical looks. The one on the left, or perhaps it was the right, spoke up. "What about us? We've built our reputation on being guns for hire, but this—" He gestured at the town and its transformed inhabitants. "This is something else entirely." Judge Hawthorne stepped forward, his weathered face thoughtful. "Thunder Creek could use men with your skills, not as hired guns, but as teachers. There are other towns in the territory that need to learn what we've learned here." The twins considered this, their synchronized movements making the moment almost ceremonial. "Teaching instead of threatening," the second twin mused. "Being part of the solution instead of the problem. It has a certain appeal." Throughout Thunder Creek, the carefully positioned townspeople began to emerge from their stations. The Chinese laundryman, Li Wei, propped his Spencer carbine against a wall and straightened his simple clothes with dignity. The Mexican farrier, Miguel Ortiz, descended from his rooftop perch with the fluid grace of a man who had found new purpose in life. Doc Morrison watched it all with a physician's eye for detail. "You know what's truly remarkable," he commented to no one in particular. "Not just the physical training, but the psychological transformation. These people haven't just learned to handle weapons, they've learned to stand tall, to believe in themselves." Sarah, the young girl with the derringer, approached Caleb with newfound confidence. "Will you stay?" she asked, voicing the question that seemed to hang in the air. "Now that it's done, will you stay and teach us more?" Caleb's hands moved in a series of gentle gestures that Rachel translated with a touch of sadness. "He says, there are other towns that need what Thunder Creek has learned. Other people who need to discover their own strength." Wade, still nursing his injured hand, looked around at the town he had tried to dominate, seeing it with new eyes. "I never understood," he said quietly. "All this time, I thought power came from making people fear you. But this is real power, isn't it? People standing together, protecting each other." Morrison's musical laugh carried genuine appreciation. "Now you're beginning to understand. Though I suspect our silent friend here could teach us all a few more lessons about the nature of true power." The morning sun had climbed higher, burning away the last shadows from Thunder Creek's streets. In that clear light, everyone could see how the town had been transformed, not just physically, with its carefully arranged defenses, but spiritually. People stood straighter, looked each other in the eye, carried themselves with the quiet dignity of those who had found their own strength. Caleb moved away from the stable doorway for the first time since the confrontation began. His steps were measured, purposeful, each movement an economy of grace that spoke of years of discipline. He stopped before Wade, and his hands moved in a final message that Judge Hawthorne translated. "True change begins when we realize that every person has value, every voice matters, even those that never speak aloud. Remember this day, Mr. Wade. Remember how it feels to choose a better path." The Reeves twins had begun collecting the dropped weapons, handling them with the respect of men who understood both their danger and their necessity. "What happens now?" one of them asked. Judge Hawthorne held up the telegram from the territorial governor. "Now we begin the real work. The Wade Empire will be restructured, its power redirected toward building up communities rather than controlling them. And Thunder Creek will serve as an example of what's possible when people learn to stand together against tyranny." Morrison, watching Caleb's fluid movements, smiled his gentle smile. "And our silent friend here, he'll move on, I suspect, find another town that needs what he teaches, another place where justice needs to learn how to speak without words." In the general store, Rachel Chen looked at the Winchester rifle she had held with such purpose, understanding now that it was more than just a weapon. It was a symbol of the change Caleb had brought to Thunder Creek. "Will others come?" she asked. "Men like Wade, thinking to take advantage once you're gone?" Caleb's response, translated by the judge, carried both warning and promise. "They might, but they'll find more than they bargained for. Because what I leave behind isn't just trained defenders, it's a community that has learned its own worth, its own strength, and that's something no amount of money or hired guns can defeat." The aftermath of the confrontation rippled through Thunder Creek like wind across prairie grass. Word spread fast in frontier towns, but this was different. This wasn't just another tale of gunfight glory or quick-draw prowess. This was a story about transformation, about how a silent stranger had turned an entire community from victims into guardians of their own destiny. In the days that followed, Wade's father arrived from Cheyenne, his usual bombastic manner subdued by the reality of what had transpired. Augustus Wade was a man used to solving problems with money or threats, but he found himself facing something entirely new, a united community that could neither be bought nor bullied. "Remarkable," the elder Wade mused, watching from the Golden Nuggets balcony as Caleb worked with a group of townspeople in the street below. He's not just teaching them to handle weapons, he's teaching them to think differently about power itself. Judge Hawthorne, sharing a morning coffee with the cattle baron, nodded thoughtfully. "That's what makes him truly dangerous to men like you used to be, Augustus. Not his skill with a gun, though that's considerable, but his ability to show people their own strength." Below, Caleb's hands moved in precise gestures as he demonstrated proper stance and positioning to a mixed group of students. Chinese laundrymen stood alongside Mexican laborers and shopkeepers' wives, all learning the subtle art of defending what was theirs. Morrison had chosen to stay, at least for a while, his gentle voice adding verbal instruction to Caleb's silent demonstrations. "Balance," he would say, walking among the students. Everything begins with balance. In your stance, in your mind, in your community. Our friend here understood that long before any of us. The Reeves twins had found their own niche in Thunder Creek's transformation. Their mirror image movements, once used to terrorize, now served to demonstrate the importance of coordination and teamwork in defense. They worked primarily with family groups, showing parents and children how to protect each other. "Never thought I'd see the day," Doc Morrison commented, watching the twins guide a shopkeeper's family through defensive positions. Those two were infamous for tearing families apart. Now here they are, helping to make them stronger. Rachel Chen had taken on the role of primary interpreter for Caleb's increasingly complex lessons. She noticed how his teachings went far beyond mere physical defense. His gestures spoke of strategy, of community organization, of the importance of everyone playing their part in the larger whole. "It's like a dance," she explained to a group of newcomers. "Each person has their steps, their position, their moment to move. Together, we create something stronger than any one person could." Be alone. One morning, about a week after the confrontation, James Hawkins found Caleb making adjustments to the stable's layout. The former ally of Wade watched in fascination as the mute gunslinger transformed simple architectural features into subtle, defensive positions, Hawkins mused, cleaning his wire-rimmed spectacles. "I've been studying your methods. The way you layer your preparations, physical, psychological, social, is not just about defense, is it? It's about changing how people see themselves." Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel, never far away these days, translated. "He says true strength isn't in the gun or the hand that holds it. It's in the heart that knows when to act and the mind that knows how to prepare." The transformation of Thunder Creek attracted attention from other communities in the territory. Visitors would arrive ostensibly for trade or business, but their real purpose was to observe how one town had managed to break free from the cycle of violence and exploitation that plagued so many frontier settlements. Judge Hawthorne found himself acting as an unofficial ambassador, explaining to these visitors the deeper principles behind Thunder Creek's change. "It's not just about learning to shoot straight," he would say. "It's about learning to stand straight, to look a man in the eye and know your own worth." Augustus. Wade, watching his empire transform under the new arrangements, discovered something unexpected. Profits actually increased when workers were treated fairly and communities were allowed to thrive. "All those years," he confided to Morrison one evening, "I thought fear was the only way to maintain control, never realized that willing cooperation could be more profitable than forced submission." The changes weren't just economic or social. Thunder Creek itself seemed to wear a different aspect now. The streets felt more open, more welcoming, yet somehow more secure. Every citizen moved with new purpose, new dignity, as if they had discovered something precious within themselves. Li Wei, the Chinese laundryman, expressed it best in his careful English. "Before, we hid. Bend low, stay quiet, hope trouble passes. By. Now we stand tall. Not because we want to fight, but because we know how to prevent fights. Very different thing." Sarah, the young girl who had played her part in the confrontation, had become something of a symbol for Thunder Creek's youth. She organized the children into messenger networks, teaching them to be alert and observant without being fearful. "Mr. Caleb showed us that being strong doesn't always mean being loud," she would say. "Sometimes the quietest person in the room is the one you should watch most carefully." But not everyone celebrated Thunder Creek's transformation. In saloons and gambling halls across the territory, certain men spoke with growing concern about this new approach to frontier justice. The idea of communities learning to defend themselves threatened many who had built their power on others' vulnerability. "Mark my words," a notorious gunman was heard to say in Laramie, "this'll spread if we don't stop it." Next thing you know, every two-bit town in the territory will be getting ideas about standing up for themselves. These rumblings reached Thunder Creek through the telegraph office, where Jenkins had learned to pay careful attention to certain types of messages. "Threats coming in from all over," he reported to Judge Hawthorne. "Seems our quiet friend has stirred up quite a hornet's nest." Caleb received this news with his usual calm, but those who knew him well noticed subtle changes in his preparations. His lessons became more intensive, focusing increasingly on how the town could defend itself without his presence. His hands moved more urgently in their silent instruction, as if racing against time. "He knows," Morrison observed to Rachel one evening. "I know that what's happened here has started something bigger than this town. Bigger than any of us, maybe." The Reeves twins, with their practiced eye for danger, had begun teaching the townspeople about watching for certain types of strangers, men who asked too many questions, who studied defensive positions too carefully, who carried themselves with the particular tension of those planning violence. "The real test," one twin commented to the other, "will come when he leaves, when Thunder Creek has to stand on its own against whatever's coming." Wade, his hand healing but his shooting days clearly behind him, had found a new role in the community. His knowledge of the territory's criminal elements proved invaluable in helping prepare for future threats. "Funny thing," he mused one day, watching Caleb work with a new group of students. "All my life I thought power meant making people fear you. Never understood that real power is helping people overcome their fears." As summer began to fade toward autumn, subtle signs suggested that Caleb's work in Thunder Creek was nearing its completion. His lessons became more focused on leadership and organization, teaching key community members how to train others in the techniques he had shared. Rachel noticed it first, the way he would step back during training sessions, letting others take the lead while he observed and guided with minimal intervention. "You're preparing us for when you're gone," she said one evening. It wasn't a question. Caleb's hands moved in response, and even without translation, the meaning was clear to those who had learned to read his silent language. The time was coming when Thunder Creek would need to stand on its own, to become not just a success story, but an example for other communities seeking their own strength. Judge Hawthorne, watching a training session from his usual spot on the hotel porch, shared his observations with Morrison. "Notice how he's structured everything in layers? The outer ring of scouts and lookouts, the inner defensive positions, the communication networks. But more than that, the way he's woven it all into the town's daily life." Morrison nodded, his gentle voice thoughtful, like a spider's web, but made of people and purpose instead of silk. Every strand connected, every connection strengthening the whole. He paused, watching Caleb correct a young man's stance with silent efficiency. "You know what's coming, don't you?" "Other towns have already sent requests," the judge confirmed. "Desperate messages from communities facing their own versions of what Thunder Creek once faced. They've heard the stories. They want what we've found here." In the telegraph office, Jenkins had begun training his young apprentice not just in Morse code, but in reading between the lines of certain messages. "See here," he would explain, pointing to seemingly innocent communications. "When they mention weather conditions, they're really asking about how many gunmen are in town. Market prices often mean bribes or protection money. Mr. Caleb taught me to read the shadows in words, just like he taught us to watch the shadows in the street." The Reeves twins had developed their own unique contribution to Thunder Creek's defense system. Their mirror image movements, once used for dealing death, now served to demonstrate how pairs of defenders could cover each other's blind spots. "It's not just about shooting," the first twin explained to a group of partners training together. "It's about trust," the second continued, "about knowing exactly where your partner will be, about moving as one," they finished together. Lee Wei had transformed his laundry into something more than just a business. The back room now served as a meeting place where Chinese workers from throughout the territory could gather safely, sharing information about threats and opportunities. In the old country, he explained to Judge Hawthorne, wisdom says water is the softest thing in nature, but can wear away stone. Mr. Caleb teaches us to be like water, gentle in peace, but unstoppable when needed, the judge finished, understanding the metaphor. Sarah's messenger network had evolved into an intricate system of communication. The children of Thunder Creek, once seen as merely underfoot, now served as the town's eyes and ears. They had their own silent language of gestures, inspired by Caleb's example but adapted to their needs. It's like a game, she explained to a newcomer's child, but the most important rule is that we're not playing, we're helping keep everyone safe. Augustus Wade, watching all this from his newly reformed business empire, found himself wrestling with complex emotions. You know what troubles me most? He confided to Morrison one evening. Not the loss of power, that's brought its own rewards. It's the realization that all these people had this strength inside them all along. We just never gave them the chance to show it. Morrison's gentle laugh carried its usual hint of deadly knowledge. That's the real revolution here, isn't it? Not the guns or the tactics, but the simple truth that every person has worth, has potential. All they need is someone to show them how to find it. Caleb spent more time writing in his journal now, his precise handwriting filling pages with observations and instructions. Rachel, allowed to glimpse these entries, realized he was creating a manual not just for Thunder Creek, but for other communities that might follow their path. Each town will be different, she translated from his gestures to Judge Hawthorne. Different people, different challenges, different solutions, but the principles remain the same: unity, preparation, and the courage to stand together. The threats continued to arrive, some veiled, others blatant. Powerful men throughout the territory had recognized that Thunder Creek represented something dangerous, the idea that common people could stand against wealth and violence if properly organized. One evening, a rider arrived from Laramie with news that a group of notorious gunmen were gathering, planning to make an example of Thunder Creek. The town's response surprised even Morrison. Instead of panic, there was calm preparation. Instead of fear, there was focused activity. Every person knew their role, their position, their part in the greater whole. The defenses that Caleb had helped them create weren't just physical. They were psychological, social, woven into the very fabric of the community. Look at them, Wade marveled, watching from his office as the town's defense network activated smoothly, without fuss or confusion. No orders needed, no shots fired, but those riders turned back at the first sign they were being watched. They felt it, didn't they? The invisible web. The power of silence, Morrison agreed, his gentle voice carrying satisfaction. Your father's money couldn't buy this kind of security. No amount of hired guns could match a whole town that knows its own strength. As autumn's first chill touched the air, other changes became apparent. Thunder Creek had become a different kind of boom town, not based on gold or cattle, but on knowledge. People came from all over the territory, not to strike it rich, but to learn. Some stayed a few days, others weeks, absorbing what they could of the methods Caleb had developed. The first snow of winter dusted Thunder Creek's rooftops with white, but the town's warmth came from more than just its well-tended fires. In the months since the confrontation with Wade, something remarkable had taken root and flourished, a sense of purpose that transformed everyday activities into expressions of community strength. One cold morning, Morrison found Caleb adding new entries to his journal, the scratching of his pencil, the only sound in the stable's early quiet. You know what's happening out there, don't you? The gentle-voiced gunman asked, warming his hands around a cup of coffee. It's spreading. Every rider that leaves here carries more than just memories. They carry ideas. Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel, who had become as much historian as translator, spoke his words. Ideas are like seeds. They only need good soil and time to grow. The truth of this was becoming evident throughout the territory. Reports arrived daily of other communities beginning to stand against oppression. Some attempts failed, others succeeded, but the pattern was clear. Thunder Creek had become more than just a town. It had become a symbol of what was possible. Judge Hawthorne, reviewing reports from his circuit, noted the changes. Denton Creek drove out the Harlow gang last week, he told the town council. Not with guns or violence, but with the kind of organized resistance we've developed here. The merchants simply refused to serve them. The stable wouldn't take their horses. The saloon wouldn't pour their drinks. When every door in town is close to you, even the most hardened outlaw starts to get the message. The Reeves twins had begun traveling to nearby settlements, teaching what they had learned about coordinated defense. Their reputation, once a source of terror, now drew people eager to learn how two could move as one, how communities could organize their own protection. Funny thing, the first twin commented during a training session, how teaching feels better than threatening, the second completed. Like we found what we were meant to do all along, they finished together. But with success came new challenges. The very effectiveness of Thunder Creek's transformation had drawn attention from powers far beyond the territory. Corporate interests, watching their control over frontier towns weaken, had begun sending more subtle threats than mere gunmen. Bank loans suddenly called in, Augustus Wade explained during a town meeting. Supply lines mysteriously disrupted. They're trying to strangle communities that show too much independence. Caleb's response to these tactics revealed new depths to his strategic thinking. His hands moved in complex patterns as he outlined plans not just for physical defense, but for economic resistance. Rachel translated while Judge Hawthorne took notes. Communities must support each other. When one town is threatened, others must step in. Share resources, reroute supplies, create new trade routes. The frontier's strength lies in its connections, not its isolation. Word spread through the Chinese laundries, those unofficial but vital communication networks of the West. Liwei's back room became a hub for coordinating economic cooperation between communities. Like Mr. Caleb teaches, he explained to visiting merchants, many small threads make strong rope. Many small towns working together make strong territory. Sarah's messenger network had expanded beyond Thunder Creek's boundaries, connecting with children in other settlements. They carried more than just news now. They carried hope, examples of how their own towns could change. It's like a story being written in footsteps, she told Rachel one evening. Every message we carry adds another line, another chapter. And the best part? Everyone gets to help write it. Morrison, watching all this unfold, found himself increasingly fascinated by the subtle power of Caleb's methods. You've created something remarkable here, he mused one evening. Not just a defensive system, but a whole new way of thinking about power and resistance. Indeed, Thunder Creek had become a living laboratory for a different kind of frontier. Justice. The town still had its share of troubles, no place is perfect, but the way it handled problems had fundamentally changed. When a group of desperate rustlers tried to raid the Wade Ranch, they found themselves facing not guns and violence, but a community organized to isolate and contain them. Streets were mysteriously emptied. Supplies became unavailable. Escape routes were quietly blocked, like trying to fight smoke. One frustrated rustler complained after surrendering. Couldn't get a clean shot, couldn't find a safe rest, couldn't even water our horses without running into some part of their invisible net. James Hawkins, now serving as Thunder Creek's unofficial strategist, had documented these techniques in his own journal. The genius of it, he explained to visiting town leaders, is that it minimizes violence while maximizing effectiveness. We don't try to outshoot our problems, we simply make it impossible for them to take root. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Thunder Creek's example had begun to influence territorial politics. Judge Hawthorne found himself increasingly called upon to mediate disputes between other communities and the business interests that had once controlled them. "The balance of power is shifting," he observed to Caleb one cold evening, "not through violence or revolution, but through communities learning to stand together to protect their own interests." Caleb's response, translated by Rachel, carried both pride and warning. Change brings resistance. The old powers won't fade quietly. Thunder Creek must be ready to help others weather the storms ahead. These storms were already gathering. Corporate agents, more sophisticated than common gunmen, began appearing in frontier towns. They came with briefcases instead of gun belts, offering deals that promised prosperity but threatened independence. Augustus Wade, drawing on his business experience, helped communities recognize and resist these subtle attacks. "They'll offer you everything you think you want," he would warn town councils. "But read the fine print. That's where they hide the chains." Through it all, Caleb continued his work, though his methods had evolved. His lessons now focused less on individual defense and more on community organization. His hands moved in increasingly, complex patterns, teaching concepts that went far beyond simple survival. "He's not just teaching us to protect ourselves anymore," Rachel realized one day. "He's teaching us to build something new, something that can last." The winter winds brought more than just snow to Thunder Creek. They carried whispers of other communities following their example. In saloons and gathering places across the territory, people spoke of towns where the powerless had found their strength, where unity had overcome corruption. One morning, a rider arrived from a small settlement near the Montana border. The town had successfully driven off a mining company's attempt to seize their land, using methods they'd learned from Thunder Creek's example. "Didn't fire a shot," the rider reported proudly. "Just stood together, blocked their surveys, refused their bribes, kept our deeds locked up safe. After a week they packed up and left." Morrison's gentle laugh carried genuine joy. "You see what you've started?" he asked Caleb. "It's not just about defense anymore. It's about dignity, about people remembering they have the right to stand tall." The morning sun glinted off Thunder Creek's snow-covered roofs as Caleb made his rounds, checking positions, adjusting arrangements, ensuring the town's defenses remained strong. But those who knew him well could sense a change in his movements, a shift in his purpose. "He's restless," Rachel observed to Judge Hawthorne, "like a bird that knows spring is coming even in the depths of winter." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "There are other towns calling for him, other places that need what he's taught us here. The real question is, are we ready to stand alone?" The answer to that question was being tested daily. Corporate interests, frustrated by Thunder Creek's example, had begun hiring a new kind of operative, men and women skilled in turning communities against themselves. They came with smiles and promises, seeking to plant seeds of discord where unity had grown strong. But Thunder Creek had been well prepared for such tactics. Lee Way's network of laundries served as an early warning system, identifying these agents. Before they could establish themselves, the Reeves twins had developed methods for neutralizing their influence without resorting to violence. "Sunlight," the first twin would say, "is the best disinfectant. Show people the truth," the second would continue, "and lies wither on their own," they'd finish together. Morrison found himself increasingly involved in training others to recognize and counter these subtle threats. His gentle voice carried new authority as he explained the patterns to watch for. "They'll try to find cracks in your unity, old grievances, petty jealousies, religious or racial divisions. That's where they'll try to drive their wedges." One cold afternoon, a wealthy railroad representative arrived in Thunder Creek, offering to make the town a major hub on a new line. The proposal seemed generous, promising jobs and prosperity. But James Hawkins, reviewing the contracts with his accountant's eye, found the poison pills hidden in the fine print. "See here," he pointed out to the town council. "These clauses would give them control over water rights, shipping rates, even property values. They're not offering to make us a hub. They're trying to buy our independence with gilded chains." The railroad man, unused to such scrutiny from a frontier town, grew increasingly frustrated. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "Progress can't be stopped. You can either be part of it or be left behind." Caleb's response, translated by Rachel, became another lesson for the community. Progress without freedom is just another form of chains. True progress lifts everyone, not just those who hold the reins. The failed attempt to co-opt Thunder Creek led to more sophisticated approaches. Anonymous letters began arriving, trying to sow discord between different groups in the community. Rumors were spread, attempting to create doubt about the town's chosen path, but these tactics found little purchase in soil that had been carefully prepared against such threats. Sarah's messenger network proved particularly effective at countering misinformation, spreading truth faster than lies could take root. "It's like Mr. Caleb taught us," she explained to a group of newly recruited young runners. "Information is like water. It needs clear channels to flow properly. When we keep those channels open and honest, truth finds its own way." The winter deepened, but Thunder Creek's strength only grew. The town had become a model of what frontier communities could achieve when they stood together. Merchants who had once competed now cooperated, sharing resources and information. Families who had barely spoken now worked together in defense. Teams. Augustus Wade, watching this transformation from his reformed business empire, found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for change. Other wealthy ranchers and businessmen sought his advice, curious about how adaptation had actually improved his fortunes. "The old way was about control," he would explain. "This new way is about cooperation. And here's the surprise. Cooperation is more profitable in the long run. Happy workers work better. Prosperous communities buy more. It's simple economics once you let go of the need to dominate." As news of Thunder Creek's success spread, other communities began experimenting with similar methods. Some failed, others succeeded, but each attempt added to a growing body of knowledge about how frontier towns could protect their independence. Judge Hawthorne's circuit rides now included regular stops to advise these emerging networks of resistance. "The key," he would tell town leaders, "is understanding that strength doesn't come from weapons or wealth. It comes from unity, from every person knowing they have a vital role to play." The Reeves twins had become traveling instructors, moving between communities to help establish defense networks. Their reputation had shifted so dramatically that towns now competed to host their training sessions. "Remember when we were feared?" one twin asked his brother during a rare, quiet moment. "Now we're welcomed," the other replied. "Because we learned a better way," they concluded together. But perhaps the most significant change was in how Thunder Creek handled internal conflicts. When disputes arose, they were no longer settled with fists or guns. The community had developed its own methods of mediation and justice based on principles Caleb had taught them. "Look at this," Morrison marveled one day, watching a potential feud between ranchers being resolved through community intervention. No shots fired, no blood spilled, just people working together to find solutions. "If you'd told me a year ago this was possible in a frontier town, I'd have called you a dreamer." Caleb's journal had grown thick with observations and instructions. Rachel, helping to organize these notes, realized he was creating more than just a manual. He was documenting the birth of a new way of life on the frontier. "Each entry," she told Judge Hawthorne, "is like a seed crystal, something for other communities to grow around." He's not just teaching us to defend ourselves, he's showing us how to build something entirely new. As winter tightened its grip on the territory, Thunder Creek received an unexpected visitor. A reporter from a major Eastern newspaper had heard rumors of the town's transformation and arrived to investigate. His initial skepticism quickly gave way to fascination. "It's remarkable," he wrote in his notebook, watching the town's daily routines. "Every citizen moves with purpose. Every action seems part of a larger pattern. Even the children appear to have specific roles, though they maintain the joy and playfulness of youth." Morrison, designated as one of the reporter's guides, explained the deeper principles at work. "Notice how the townspeople gather in small groups throughout the day? They're not just socializing, they're maintaining communication networks, sharing information, staying alert without appearing militant. The Reeves twins demonstrated their training methods, showing how pairs of citizens learn to work together, covering each other's blind spots, both literally and figuratively." The reporter was particularly struck by how seamlessly different ethnic groups cooperated. "In most frontier towns," he observed, "you see clear divisions. Chinese keep to themselves, Mexicans to themselves, whites to themselves. But here we learned that survival depends on unity," Leeway interjected, his English now confident and clear. "Mr. Caleb teaches us strength not in being the same, but in working together because of differences. Each group brings different skills, different knowledge." Sarah's messenger network provided another source of fascination. The reporter watched as children played what appeared to be simple games, but were actually complex training exercises in observation and communication. "There are eyes and ears," Rachel explained. "But more than that, they're our future. Every game they play, every message they carry, teaches them the value of community and cooperation." The reporter's attention was particularly drawn to the town's handling of a potential crisis. A group of trail-hardened cowboys had arrived, traditionally a moment of tension in frontier communities. But Thunder Creek's response was unlike anything he'd witnessed. Instead of nervous shopkeepers and wary citizens, the cowboys found themselves subtly guided by the town's invisible networks. Certain areas were casually made inaccessible, while others offered comfortable hospitality. Any hint of trouble was met not with confrontation, but with quiet, organized resistance. "Like trying to punch a cloud," one frustrated cowboy complained to his companions. "Can't even find a place to start trouble, let alone make it." Judge Hawthorne, reading the reporter's preliminary notes, offered additional context. "What you're seeing isn't just a defensive system, it's a new way of organizing society. Every person has a role, a purpose, but not through force or coercion. They choose to participate because they've seen the benefits of unity." Augustus Wade, now fully committed to the new way of doing business, shared his own perspective. "The old system was built on fear. Fear of violence, fear of poverty, fear of those who were different. What Caleb taught us was how to replace fear with purpose. When people know their worth, when they understand their role in protecting and building their community, fear loses its power." The reporter's questions eventually turned to Caleb himself, but found the town protective of their silent teacher. Morrison, with his gentle voice and deadly knowledge, provided the clearest explanation. "Some men change things through speeches, some through force of arms. Our friend found a different way, through silence and example. He showed us that true strength isn't in making noise, but in working together with quiet purpose." As the reporter prepared to leave, Thunder Creek faced another test. A telegram arrived warning of a large group of displaced workers heading their way, victims of a mining company's sudden closure of operations. In the past, such news would have sparked fear and defensive preparations. Instead, Thunder Creek mobilized in a different way. The community gathered to discuss how to help these troubled travelers while maintaining their own security. Caleb's hands moved in a series of complex instructions, which Rachel translated for the town council. "Every crisis is an opportunity. These men are not our enemies. They're victims of the same forces we've learned to resist. Show them another way. The reporter stayed to watch how the situation unfolded. He saw the town prepare, not with weapons and barricades, but with food, shelter, and most importantly, information. When the displaced workers arrived, they found not a hostile fortress, but a community ready to share both resources and knowledge. See, Morrison explained to the amazed reporter, this is the real revolution. Not just protecting ourselves, but showing others how to find their own strength. Every person who passes through here carries these lessons with them, like seeds, scattered on fertile ground. The Eastern newspaperman's final observation captured the essence of Thunder Creek's transformation. In a land where power has traditionally grown from the barrel of a gun, this remarkable community has discovered a different source of strength. They have learned that true security comes not from the ability to harm others, but from the commitment to help each other. Their silent teacher has shown them that the deadliest weapon against tyranny is not violence, but the quiet strength of unity. Spring came early to Thunder Creek that year, the last traces of snow melting away to reveal a town transformed not just by the changing season, but by the deeper changes that had taken root during the winter months. Those who knew how to read the signs could sense another change coming, one that brought both anticipation and a touch of sadness to the community. Caleb's movements had taken on a new quality, a sense of completion rather than preparation. His daily rounds now focused more on observing than instructing, watching how the town's complex defense networks functioned without his direct guidance. "He's getting ready to leave, isn't he?" Rachel asked Morrison one morning, watching Caleb work with what would likely be his last group of students. The gentle-voiced gunman nodded, his eyes holding a mix of understanding and respect. "It was always going to happen," Morrison replied softly. "Men like him, they're like spring rain. They come when needed, help things grow, then move on to where they're needed next. The real test isn't in their presence, but in what remains after they're gone." The signs of Caleb's impending departure were subtle, but clear to those who had learned to read such things. His journal entries had become more focused on long-term planning rather than daily operations. His training sessions increasingly emphasized leadership and adaptation rather than specific techniques. Judge Hawthorne, reviewing the latest batch of messages from other communities, understood the urgency behind these preparations. 3 towns in the Dakota Territory facing railroad takeovers, 2 mining communities in Montana being squeezed by corporate interests, a ranching settlement in Colorado threatened by land grabbers. He looked up at Caleb. They're all asking for help, all hoping for their own silent teacher. Caleb's response, translated by Rachel, revealed the deeper strategy behind his methods. No community can rely on a single protector. True strength comes from within, from people standing together. Thunder Creek must become more than just an example. It must become a teacher in its own right. The Reeves twins, preparing for another training journey to nearby settlements, had begun to understand their own role in this larger plan. They were no longer just instructors of defense techniques. They had become carriers of a new way of thinking, about community and resistance. "It's like ripples in a pond," the first twin observed. "Each town we help creates its own ripples," the second continued. "Until the whole territory is transformed," they concluded together. Lee Wei's network of laundries had evolved into something far more sophisticated than a simple communication system. It has become a vital link between communities, sharing not just information but resources and support. When one town faced pressure from corporate interests, others could respond with economic assistance and practical aid. "Like Mr. Caleb always says," Lee Wei explained to a group of visiting merchants, "single sticks are easy to break, bundle of sticks unbreakable. Same with towns. Together we stand strong." Sarah's messenger network had grown beyond its original scope, connecting young people across multiple communities. The children's games now carried more than just local news. They transmitted coded updates about corporate movements, hired gun activities, and community needs across the territory. "We're building something bigger than just one town's defense," she told her young runners. "We're building a future where communities protect each other." Augustus Wade, fully embracing his role in the new order, had begun using his business connections to support other towns facing corporate pressure. His reformed empire now served as a model for how frontier businesses could thrive while supporting community independence. "The old way was about domination," he explained to a group of skeptical fellow ranchers. "This new way is about cooperation. And here's the truth that surprised me most. Cooperation is more profitable in the long run. Happy communities do better business than frightened ones." Morrison, watching all these preparations with his characteristic gentle attention, noticed something that others might have missed. "Every person Caleb trained," he mused to Judge Hawthorne, "carries a piece of his method, his understanding. But it's more than that. Each one has adapted those lessons to their own strengths, their own ways of working." The judge nodded thoughtfully. "That's the real genius of his approach. He didn't create followers, he created teachers. Each person who learns from him becomes a source of knowledge and strength for others." Thunder Creek itself had become something of a living laboratory for this approach. Visitors from other communities didn't just learn specific techniques, they absorbed a whole new way of thinking about power and resistance. They learned how everyday activities could be transformed into elements of community defense, how normal social networks could become early warning systems. James Hawkins, maintaining his detailed records of the town's transformation, had begun systematizing these lessons for other communities. "The key," he explained to a group of visiting town leaders, "is understanding that every aspect of community life can serve multiple purposes. A children's game becomes a communication network. A laundry becomes an intelligence center. A stable becomes a training ground." But with the signs of Caleb's eventual departure becoming clearer, some in Thunder Creek struggled with uncertainty about the future. Rachel found him in the stable one evening, making careful adjustments to his saddle, another small sign of preparation. "Will it be enough?" she asked, not needing to specify what it meant. "Have we learned enough to stand on our own?" Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel translated the gestures more for herself than any observers. A teacher's greatest success isn't in what students learn, but in what they create for themselves. Thunder Creek has found its own strength, its own voice, even if that voice often speaks in whispers and subtle gestures. The truth of this was demonstrated the very next day when a group of corporate agents arrived from Cheyenne attempting to pressure local merchants into exclusive supply contracts. Before Caleb could intervene, Thunder Creek's networks activated smoothly and effectively. Sarah's young runners spread the word through their seemingly innocent games. Leeway's laundry network began tracking the agents' movements. The Reeves, twins, trained pairs of citizens, maintained subtle but constant observation. Within hours, the agents found themselves politely but firmly isolated. Every attempt at manipulation met with coordinated resistance. "Notice," Morrison pointed out to a group of observers, "how no one had to give orders. No shots fired, no threats made, just a community working together like fingers on a hand." The corporate agents departed within days, frustrated by their inability to gain any leverage. Their report back to their employers, intercepted by Thunder Creek's information network, revealed the success of Caleb's methods. Town appears unbreakable. Population unified in resistance. Traditional pressure tactics are ineffective. The spring rains had brought new growth to the territory, and with it came more signs of change, spreading beyond Thunder Creek's boundaries. Reports arrived daily of other communities beginning to stand against various forms of oppression, each finding their own way to adapt the lessons Thunder Creek had pioneered. It's like watching a garden grow, Judge Hawthorne observed. Each community taking the seeds of these ideas and growing them in their own soil, adapting them to their own needs. The evening sun cast long shadows across Thunder Creek's main street as Caleb made what everyone somehow knew would be one of his last rounds of inspection. But now the town watched his movements with understanding rather than anxiety. They had learned to read not just his gestures, but the deeper messages in his methods. That night, an unexpected arrival brought news that would test Thunder Creek's preparedness sooner than anyone had anticipated. A rider from the Dakota Territory arrived, his horse lathered and breathing hard, carrying urgent messages from several threatened communities. "They're moving faster now," Judge Hawthorne explained, "to the hastily gathered town council. The railroad consortiums, the mining companies, the land speculators. They've realized what's happening. They're trying to break as many communities as they can before the resistance spreads further." Caleb's hands moved in the lamplight, and Rachel translated, "Then it's time for Thunder Creek to show what it has truly learned, not just how to defend itself, but how to help others find their strength." The town's response demonstrated just how far they had come. Without needing direction, the various networks began to mobilize. Leeway's laundry connections spread the word through Chinese communities across the territory. The Reeves twins prepared for an extended training journey, while Sarah's messenger network began gathering detailed information about the threatened towns. Morrison watched it all with his gentle smile. "You see," he said to the Dakota rider, "this is what your communities can become, not just strong enough to resist pressure, but strong enough to help others resist as well." Augustus Wade committed significant resources to the effort, but in a way that reflected the new methods he had learned. "We won't just send money," he explained to his business partners. "We'll show them how to establish their own economic independence, teach them to use their existing resources and connections in ways the corporations can't control." The next few days saw Thunder Creek transform into a center of strategic planning. Maps were spread across tables in the hotel dining room, showing the locations of threatened communities and potential support networks. James Hawkins worked tirelessly to adapt Thunder Creek's defensive systems for different situations and terrains. "Each town has its own character, its own strengths," he explained, marking potential coordination points. "The key is helping them find and develop those strengths, not just copying what worked here." The Reeves twins had begun developing new training methods specifically for rapid implementation. "Not everyone has months to prepare," the first twin observed. "So we adapt the essentials," the second continued. "Focus on what can be done quickly but effectively," they finished together. Rachel noticed how Caleb watched these preparations with a particular intensity. His hands moved in comment, which she translated for Morrison. "This is the real test, not just of Thunder Creek's strength, but of the idea itself. Can communities truly stand together, help each other grow stronger?" The answer began to emerge as Thunder Creek's networks expanded their reach. Leeway received messages from Chinese communities as far away as San Francisco, offering support and resources. Sarah's young runners established contact with children in distant settlements, creating new channels for information and coordination. "It's like watching a spider web catch the morning dew," Morrison mused. "Each drop connects to others, strengthens the whole pattern." Judge Hawthorne, reviewing reports from his circuit, noted how the resistance was adapting to different challenges. In mining towns, they're focusing on worker unity and supply control. In farming communities, it's about coordinated crop planning and shared resources. In ranching territories, they're developing new ways to manage grazing rights and water access. One evening, as Thunder Creek hummed with preparation, Caleb added final entries to his journal. Rachel, helping to organize these materials, realized he was creating more than just a record. He was laying out a vision for the future. "Look at this," she showed Morrison. "He's mapped out how resistance movements could spread across the entire frontier, not through violence or confrontation, but through communities learning from each other, supporting each other, growing stronger together." The gentle-voiced gunman nodded appreciatively. "That's always been his true genius, hasn't it? Not just teaching people to defend themselves, but showing them how to build something worth defending." As spring flowers began to bloom across the prairie, Thunder Creek received word of the first successes. A mining town in Montana had successfully resisted corporate takeover by implementing coordinated community action. A farming settlement in Dakota had protected its water rights through unified legal and economic pressure. "It's working," Augustus Wade announced to the town council. "Not just here, not just in isolated pockets, but across the whole frontier. Communities are learning to stand together, to resist pressure without violence, to build real independence." But with these successes came new challenges. Corporate interests, recognizing the threat to their power, began hiring more sophisticated operators. These weren't just gunmen or economic pressure agents, they were experts in dividing communities, in finding and exploiting weaknesses in social bonds. Caleb's response to these threats revealed the depth of his strategic thinking. His hands moved in complex patterns as he outlined new defensive approaches, which Rachel translated for the growing network of resistance leaders. Unity is not just about standing together in times of trouble. It's about building connections, so strong that trouble has no place to take root. Every shared meal, every community celebration, every moment of cooperation builds armor that no external force can pierce. The truth of this philosophy was demonstrated when corporate agents attempted to exploit religious differences in a nearby settlement. They found their efforts frustrated by community bonds that transcended faith and background, bonds built through daily cooperation and mutual support. "That's what they never understand," Morrison explained to a group of visiting community leaders. "They think power comes from division and fear, but real strength grows from unity and trust. Our silent friend showed us that the strongest walls aren't built of stone, but of people standing together." As the movement grew, Thunder Creek faced a new challenge. The sheer volume of requests for help threatened to overwhelm their resources. Communities across the frontier were crying out for guidance, for training, for support in standing against various forms of oppression. Caleb's solution, translated by Rachel during a crucial town meeting, demonstrated the evolution of his strategic thinking. "We must become teachers of teachers. Each community that learns must be prepared to teach others. The knowledge must spread not in a line, but in ever-widening circles." The Reeves twins had already begun implementing this approach in their training journeys. Instead of trying to teach everything themselves, they focused on identifying and preparing local leaders who could continue the work after they moved on. "Like ripples in a pond," the first twin explained to their students. "Each of you will create your own ripples," added the second. "Until the whole frontier is transformed," they concluded together. Sarah's messenger network had grown beyond anything its young founder had imagined. The children's games that had once served to protect Thunder Creek now carried coded messages across hundreds of miles, connecting communities in an invisible web of communication and support. "Sometimes," she told Rachel, "I think about that first day when Mr. Caleb showed me how a simple game of hopscotch could carry important messages. Now look at us. We've got children from Texas to Montana playing games that keep their communities safe." Leeway's laundry network had evolved into something approaching a frontier intelligence service. Through the simple act of washing clothes, his people gathered and distributed vital information about corporate movements, hired gun activities, and community needs across the territory. "In the old country," he explained to Judge Hawthorne, They say wisdom is like water. Find every crack, fill every space. Mr. Caleb teaches us to be like water, gentle but unstoppable. Augustus Wade, watching his reformed business empire become a model for ethical frontier development, found himself reflecting on the profound changes in his own worldview. "You know what amazes me most," he confided to Morrison. "Not just that it works, but that it works better than the old way. Treating people with respect, building communities instead of exploiting them, it's actually more profitable in the long run." The gentle-voiced gunman's response carried years of deadly wisdom. That's because fear can only take so much from people, but give them hope, give them dignity, and they'll move mountains on their own. As spring advanced, bringing new growth to the prairie, Thunder Creek received word of more communities successfully standing against various forms of oppression. A cattle town in Texas had unified to resist a monopolistic meatpacking company. A mining settlement in Colorado had organized to protect their water rights from corporate seizure. But with these successes came new warnings. Corporate interests, realizing that traditional methods of control were failing, had begun hiring a different kind of operative, men and women skilled in the art of psychological warfare. "They're studying our methods," James Hawkins reported, reviewing intelligence gathered through their networks, trying to understand how we build unity so they can find ways to break it. Caleb's response to this threat revealed yet another layer of his strategic thinking. His hands moved in complex patterns as he outlined new defensive approaches, which Rachel translated for the growing network of resistance leaders. "They think they can break our unity by understanding it. But true unity isn't a technique that can be countered. It's a way of life that must be lived. Every shared meal, every barn raising, every moment of community support builds bonds that no outside force can sever." The truth of this philosophy was put to the test when corporate agents attempted to create division in Thunder Creek itself, hoping to show that even the movement's founding community could be broken. They found themselves facing not just organized resistance, but a kind of unified response that their reports described as frustratingly impenetrable. Like trying to fight smoke, one frustrated agent was overheard complaining in a Cheyenne saloon. "Can't find any cracks to work with. Every attempt to create division just seems to make them stronger." Morrison's gentle laugh carried genuine appreciation when he heard this report. "That's the real victory, isn't it? Not just that we can stand against them, but that their every attempt to break us only makes us stronger." As the sun set on another busy day in Thunder Creek, Caleb stood in the stable doorway, watching the community he had helped build go about its evening routines. His hands moved in a brief comment that Rachel translated for Judge Hawthorne. "Sometimes the strongest seeds are those planted in the hardest soil. Thunder Creek was hard soil once, a place of fear and division. Now look at what has grown here." The judge nodded thoughtfully, understanding that these words were both observation and farewell. "And like any good crop," he replied, "it's ready to scatter its own seeds on the wind." The morning Thunder Creek had both anticipated and dreaded finally arrived, with the first hints of summer heat shimmering on the horizon. Caleb's preparations for departure were characteristically subtle. A few small adjustments to his saddle, a final review of his journal's entries, quiet moments spent observing the town's daily rhythms from his usual spot in the stable doorway. Morrison found him there just as dawn was breaking, the gentle-voiced gunman's approach as measured as ever. "You know," he mused, leaning against the weathered doorframe, "I've seen a lot of men leave their mark on frontier towns. Usually it's in notches on a gun belt or crosses in a graveyard. But what you've built here," he gestured at the awakening town. "This is something entirely new." Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel, arriving with her morning delivery of fresh bread, translated, "The strongest marks are the ones that keep growing even after you've moved on." The town had begun gathering, not in an obvious crowd, but in the careful, coordinated way they had learned under Caleb's tutelage. Groups appeared to be going about their normal morning routines, but those who understood the patterns could see how they were positioning themselves to bid farewell to their silent teacher. Judge Hawthorne, watching from his usual spot on the hotel porch, noted how even this gathering demonstrated the principles they had learned. "Look at them," he commented to Augustus Wade. "Not just standing around waiting, they're maintaining their defensive positions, keeping watch positions covered, staying ready even in their grief." The Reeves twins had returned from their latest training journey, specifically for this morning. They stood with their characteristic mirror-image precision, but their usual stoic expressions showed hints of emotion. "He's not just leaving a town. Behind," the first twin observed. "He's leaving a movement," the second continued. "That will keep growing long after he's gone," they finished together. Li Wei emerged from his laundry, carrying not clothes, but a carefully wrapped package. "In the old country," he said, presenting it to Caleb, "great teachers pass down wisdom through written words, but you—" He smiled as Caleb unwrapped a beautifully bound blank journal. "You teach through silence. This is for the next town, next lessons, next seeds to plant." Sarah's messenger network had spread the word of Caleb's departure in their own special way. Young runners from nearby communities had arrived, ostensibly playing their usual games, but actually creating a living map of how far his influence had spread. "See the patterns," she explained to Rachel, pointing out how the children's movements mimicked the spread of Caleb's teaching across the territory. Each game shows another town that's learned, another community that's found its strength. James Hawkins had spent the night organizing and copying the extensive notes he'd kept on. "Thunder Creek's transformation. It's not just a record," he explained, presenting the bound volumes to Caleb. "It's a blueprint for others to follow, adapt, and improve upon." Caleb's hands moved in response, and Rachel translated, "The best blueprints are written not in ink, but in the hearts and actions of people who understand their true purpose." As the morning progressed, representatives from other communities began arriving, not in an obvious delegation, but in ones and twos, each carrying stories of how their towns had changed after implementing Caleb's methods. A merchant from a mining town in Montana described how their community had unified to resist corporate pressure. "They tried to starve us out, control our supply lines. But we'd learned from Thunder Creek's example, created our own networks, supported each other. Now they can't find a single weak point to exploit." A rancher from the Dakota Territory spoke of how neighboring communities had learned to work together. "Used to be every town for itself, every rancher fighting his own battles. Now we've got a network of mutual support that covers 3 territories. When trouble hits one place, help comes from all around." Morrison, observing these arrivals with his characteristic gentle attention, noted something significant. "They're not here to beg you to stay, to ask for more direct help. They're here to show you that your work has taken root, that it can grow without your constant presence." Augustus Wade, who had once embodied the very forces Caleb had taught them to resist, now stood as a testament to the possibility of transformation. "You've shown us that true power isn't in controlling others," he said, his voice carrying genuine understanding. "It's in helping them find their own strength." Caleb's response, translated by Rachel, carried both pride and warning. "Remember that strength isn't just in standing against threats. It's in building something worth protecting, something that grows stronger with each challenge it faces." The town's defensive networks remained active even during these farewell gatherings. Lookouts maintained their posts, communication systems stayed alert, the careful choreography of community protection continued without interruption. "That's what makes this work," Judge Hawthorne explained to a visiting town leader. "It's not just a system of defense, it's become a way of life. Every person knows their role, understands their part in protecting not just their own safety, but the community's very soul. Sarah had organized her young messengers for one final demonstration. At a signal, children throughout the town began their seemingly innocent games, but the patterns of their play spelled out a message visible only to those who knew how to read. The strongest voice is the one that speaks through others' actions. As the sun climbed higher, Caleb began his final inspection of Thunder Creek's defenses. But this wasn't just a review of physical positions and tactical arrangements. It was an assessment of how deeply his teachings had taken root in the community's daily life. As afternoon shadows lengthened across Thunder Creek's transformed streets, the moment of departure drew near. Caleb stood in the stable doorway where his story in this town had begun, his presence as quiet yet powerful as ever. But now he wasn't alone in his silence. The entire community had learned to speak in the language of purposeful action and unified strength. Morrison, who had chosen to stay and continue teaching in Thunder Creek, stood nearby, his gentle voice carrying across the gathered crowd. "You know what's remarkable. When you first arrived, this was a town scared of its own shadow. Now look at them. They don't just stand tall, they teach others to do the same." The Reeves twins had positioned themselves at strategic points, their mirror image vigilance maintaining security even in this moment of farewell. They had found their true calling not as hired guns, but as teachers of community defense. "Some men leave graves behind," the first twin observed. "Others leave buildings or fortunes," the second added. "But you're leaving something that keeps growing," they concluded together. Rachel, who had given voice to Caleb's silence for so long, found herself translating one final series of lessons. His hands moved with familiar grace as he shared his last direct teachings with Thunder Creek. "True strength isn't in the weapon you carry, but in the community you build. Real power isn't in making others fear you, but in helping them find their own courage. The most effective defense isn't in walls or guns, but in people standing together, watching out for each other, helping each other grow stronger." Judge Hawthorne, representing the legal authority that had once seemed the only source of justice in the territory, spoke of the deeper change he'd witnessed. "What we've learned here goes beyond law books and court orders. You've shown us that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing, it's about building communities strong enough to prevent it." Leeway's laundry network had expanded far beyond Thunder Creek, connecting communities across the frontier in ways that transcended traditional boundaries. "Like washing clothes," he explained to newcomers, "each piece connected, each part supporting others. Whole territory becomes one big family, watching out for each other." Sarah's young messengers had developed their own way of saying goodbye. Throughout the day, they played their games in patterns that spelled out messages of gratitude and commitment, visible to those who had learned to read such things. Their seemingly innocent activities now carried the seeds of future resistance and community strength. Augustus Wade, once the very embodiment of the oppression Caleb had taught them to resist, stood as living proof that change was possible. "I used to think power flowed from the barrel of a gun or the weight of a bag," he admitted. "Now I understand that real power grows from the bonds between people, from communities standing together." As Caleb mounted his horse, his movements carrying the same fluid grace that had once marked him as a deadly gunfighter, Thunder Creek demonstrated one final time how well they had learned his lessons. Without a word being spoken, the entire community shifted into defensive positions, maintaining security even in their moment of emotional farewell. "Look at that," Morrison murmured admiringly. "Not a command given, not a word spoken, but everyone knows exactly where they need to be, exactly what they need to do. That's not just training, that's transformation. James Hawkins, who had documented every step of Thunder Creek's change, presented Caleb with a final gift, a map showing how his teachings had already spread across the territory. Each mark represents a community that's learned to stand strong, he explained, and the network keeps growing. The Reeves twins had already scheduled their next training journey, ready to carry Thunder Creek's lessons to more communities in need. They had found purpose in teaching others what they had learned about unity and resistance. The silent revolution, the first twin called it, spread without a shot fired, the second added, changing the whole frontier, one town at a time. They finished together. Rachel, standing beside Caleb's horse, translated his final message to the gathered community. Remember that what we've built here isn't just about defense or resistance. It's about creating something new, a way of living where strength comes from unity, where power serves justice, where silence can speak louder than thunder. Thunder Creek's transformation had already become legend across the frontier. In saloons and gathering places throughout the territory, people spoke in hushed tones about the town that had found a different kind of strength, about the silent teacher who showed them how to stand together against oppression. As Caleb turned his horse toward the setting sun, the town's young messengers began a game that spread like a wave through the streets. To ordinary observers, it might have looked like simple play, but those who understood saw it for what it was, a promise to keep the lessons alive, to continue building on what they had learned. Judge Hawthorne, watching the silent teacher ride away, spoke words that would be remembered and repeated across the frontier. Some men change things with guns and violence, others change things with money and influence, but he changed things with silence and wisdom, showing us that the strongest voice is the one that speaks through the actions of an entire community. The sun was setting over Thunder Creek, but the town didn't mourn. They had work to do, lessons to share, communities to help. They had learned that true strength wasn't in any one person, but in the bonds between people who stood together for justice. Morrison's gentle voice carried across the evening air. You know what he taught us, really? Not just how to defend ourselves, but how to build something worth defending. Not just how to resist oppression, but how to create communities too strong to be oppressed. In the years that followed, travelers crossing the frontier would hear stories of a silent rider who appeared in troubled towns. They said he never spoke a word, but his presence brought change, not through violence or force, but through teaching communities to find their own strength, their own voice, their own way of standing together against injustice. Thunder Creek remained a beacon of hope and an example of what was possible. Other communities sought their guidance, learned from their experience, and adapted their methods to local needs. The network of resistance and mutual support grew stronger with each passing season. The legend of the silent gunslinger grew, not as a tale of deadly skill with a weapon, but as a story of transformation, of how one man's silent wisdom helped communities across the frontier find their own strength, their own voice, their own way of standing against oppression. But perhaps the truest measure of his legacy wasn't in the stories told about him, but in the quiet strength of communities that had learned to stand together, in the networks of mutual support that spread across the territory, in the children who grew up knowing that true power came not from fear or force, but from unity and purpose. As darkness fell on Thunder Creek that final evening, the town continued its watch, its defenses maintained not by fear, but by commitment to each other. They had learned that the strongest defense wasn't in weapons or walls, but in people standing together, supporting each other, building something worth protecting. The legend of the silent gunslinger lives on in the frontier's memory, not as a tale of violence or vengeance, but as a story of transformation, of how silence could speak louder than thunder, of how true strength grew from unity rather than fear, of how real power lay not in the ability to harm others, but in the commitment to help each other stand strong. And somewhere out on the frontier, they say, a silent rider still appears in troubled towns, still teaches communities to find their strength, still plants seeds of resistance and unity that grow into something stronger than any weapon. The power of people standing together, speaking through actions rather than words, building a future where justice grows from the bonds between neighbors rather than the barrel of a gun. They say that change, like the frontier wind, leaves its mark in unexpected ways. In Thunder Creek, those marks were everywhere. In the way children played their message-carrying games, in the quiet confidence of merchants who once cowered before bullies, in the unity of a community that had learned to stand as one. Lee Wei's laundry became a model for other Chinese businesses across the territory. Not just a place for washing clothes, he would explain to visitors. Place for washing away old fears, old divisions. Place where community strength gets renewed, like a clean shirt giving man a fresh start. Sarah's messenger network evolved into something even more remarkable. The children's games she had developed became a tradition passed down through generations, teaching each new crop of young ones the value of vigilance wrapped in joy, of resistance disguised as play. My grandmother taught me these games, frontier children would say decades later, not knowing their true origin, but understanding somehow that they were part of something larger than themselves. The Reeves twins continued their work, traveling from town to town, but they never forgot where their transformation began. Each year, they would return to Thunder Creek on the anniversary of Caleb's departure, standing in mirror-image silence at the stable door where it all started. Morrison remained in Thunder Creek, his gentle voice continuing to teach new generations the lessons of strength through unity. The truly remarkable thing, he would often say, isn't that one man could change so much, but that he showed us how to keep changing, keep growing, keep finding new ways to stand together. Augustus Wade's business empire transformed into a network of community-supported enterprises, proving that prosperity could grow from cooperation rather than exploitation. His example inspired other business leaders to reconsider their approaches, leading to gradual but significant changes in how frontier commerce operated. Judge Hawthorne, in his final years on the bench, wrote a series of legal opinions that incorporated the principles he had learned in Thunder Creek. His writings spoke of justice not just as law enforcement, but as community empowerment, as the right and ability of people to stand together against oppression. Rachel kept Caleb's journal, not as a relic, but as a living document. She continued to add to it, recording how his methods adapted and evolved as they spread across the frontier. The book became a kind of sacred text for communities learning to find their strength, though few ever saw the original. Thunder Creek itself became something of a pilgrimage site for communities seeking change. But visitors found no monuments, no grand buildings marking historical moments. Instead, they found a living testament to Caleb's teachings in the daily life of a town that had learned to make resistance and unity part of its very breath. The children of Thunder Creek grew up knowing they were part of something special, something that went beyond their own town's boundaries. They carried these lessons with them as they moved to other places, planting seeds of change wherever they went. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispered across the prairie, old-timers would gather to share stories of the silent gunslinger. Not tales of gunfights or violence, but stories of transformation, of how silence could teach more powerfully than words, of how true strength grew from standing together, of how one man's wordless wisdom helped an entire frontier find its voice. They say he's still out there, the silent gunslinger, riding from town to town, teaching without words, changing lives without violence, showing people that the strongest weapon against oppression is the power of a community standing as one. And perhaps he is. Or perhaps his truest legacy rides not on horseback, but in the hearts and actions of every person who has learned that real change comes not from the barrel of a gun, but from the courage to stand together, to help each other, to build something stronger than fear or force could ever be. For in the end, the story of the silent gunslinger isn't just about one man's journey. It's about the journey of an entire frontier, learning to find its strength not in violence or division, but in unity and purpose. It's a story that continues to be written in every community that stands together, in every person who chooses to resist oppression not with bullets, but with bonds of fellowship and support. And that, perhaps, is the greatest legacy any teacher could hope to leave behind. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.